The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Hello, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineering Watch Radio, Global Alert News for May 7th, 2016. Another week of unfolding cataclysm on planet Earth. Lots of stories to cover. I'll get through them as quickly as I can. The show is broadcast live on KQMS throughout Northern California Saturday mornings from 6 to 7 a.m. Also reposted on GeoEngineering Watch under the radio section, as well as on the KQMS website. I want to state that in the coming hour after this show on KQMS, congressional candidate Jeffrey Gerlach will be on the Freedom in Action show with Pete Peters. I encourage everyone to listen to that show. Jeffrey is an extremely articulate, intelligent candidate that is willing to face incredibly dire issues like global climate engineering. I've met with Jeffrey on a number of occasions, fully support him, and again, not stating that any elected official will be able to change or stop the cancer that runs this country. But if we have someone with a voice that is willing to speak out, which our current candidate is obviously doing everything to hide from issues like climate engineering and other dire issues, we need a voice like Jeffrey Gerlach. Hope everyone can tune in to the Freedom in Action show from 7 to 9 on KQMS. Now, lots and lots to cover this week. Probably won't get through all of it, but I'll do my best. When you have so many converging catastrophes unfolding at once, you can't possibly cover all of it. You can't. And the tragedy is the vast majority of the population, not just in the U.S., but other first world countries especially, are completely oblivious because they're completely distracted. And that's the objective of the power structure. So, very briefly, onto our weather and then headlines. Weather, obviously extremely important, connects to an issue that I'm completely focused on, which is the exposure and subsequent halting of global climate engineering, which again, we're talking about Earth's life support systems. Why is that so important? Not because I'm particularly interested in the weather for the sake of the weather, but because this is Earth's life support systems. It's the air we breathe, the water we drink. How could that not be a priority? I'll move through this quickly. Again, a lot of ground to cover. Gloomy over much of the U.S. It's gloomy because that's the point of solar radiation management. So how many days do we have where rain is forecast or showers? Usually a forecast that diminishes as the point in time when that forecast comes close. It turns from rain to showers to chance of showers to possible shower to nothing. Happens all the time. Yes, there's the occasional downpour here and there as something slips through the cracks of the massively aerosolized sky. And for those who don't understand how climate engineering could reduce rain, not seeding for rain, but reduce it, please investigate. Simply go online and search geoengineering reduces rainfall. That's all you have to do. Very simple. Very simple science here. When you put too many particles in the atmosphere, there's too many condensation nuclei, it tends to migrate rain. The droplets don't combine and come down, they just migrate, and it tends to melt the clouds together, so to speak. So when we see these constant overcast skies where even if you see through a break in the lower level clouds, you see a canopy of white above all that. That's not normal. It's absolutely a result of climate engineering. You don't see beams of sun shining through in so many cases because the overstory is completely covered with sprayed aerosols, which migrates the moisture inland. So the moisture that should have fallen in the west coast ends up being used to create cloud cover over half the continental U.S. And this is, again, the point of solar radiation management. Now, this is why our rain forecast so often comes less and late. The actual event is less and late. Now, as of yesterday, Friday the 6th, still record warmth in so many places in the U.S. Seattle, 80 degrees. Arizona, 100 degrees. 85 degrees in Minnesota. And this is while it's snowing in the southeast. Think about that. So we're 80 in Seattle, 85 in Minnesota. We have Canada burning to the ground. We have the Himalayas burning. How often have you heard of the Himalayas burning, really? Of course, if you watch mainstream media, you haven't heard that the Himalayas are burning to the ground. So I'll get more to that story later in this broadcast, but think about the absurdities of snow happening in the southeast while we have all these record temperatures, record fires happening. We had Denver, again, the big media trumped up snowstorm from about a week ago. Denver prior to that was 80 degrees, snowstorm, then back to 80 degrees. The planet's in total meltdown, and climate engineering and chemical ice nucleation are the only thing creating some headlines for the power structure to try to further confuse the population as long as possible. And thus they put out films like Climate Hustle. What an absurd propaganda piece that is. And if you buy into the Climate Hustle film, you're truly missing the point. Done by Mark Morano, one of the main fossil fuel industry funded disinformation people on the planet. Not hard to trace that. Verify what I'm saying. Morano is funded by the fossil fuel industry to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Is it any surprise that they will put out a film like this to try to tell people what they want to hear, that everything's fine, no damage to the planet, go on about your life, keep driving your Winnebago that gets 5 miles per gallon, and everything will turn out well. We'll just keep invading countries in the Middle East and confiscating the resources and nothing to worry about. So if you bought into the Climate Hustle film, you have been hustled. And again, it's not about liking Al Gore. I don't like Al Gore. Al Gore's a criminal. Carbon credits are a scam. But it doesn't change the fact that the planet is in total meltdown. More on that later in this story, on the fires in the Himalayas and Canada. Now, as the human race continues its suicidal tendencies on countless fronts, even now the vast majority are oblivious to the converging cataclysms that are unfolding. Even now the vast majority are too willing to continue participating in the paradigm that will very shortly bring about their own demise if there is not a complete change in direction. I stand by that, absolutely stand by that. Mathematically speaking, it's a virtual certainty. If we stay on this course, we will all meet with near-term total global extinction. If you roll your eyes and walk away, at least you were told. If you have any concern for your children whatsoever, you'll investigate what I'm saying. Not believe anything I'm saying, but investigate it. Einstein said this. We should think about this. Here's a quote from Einstein. Two things are infinite: the universe and human stupidity. And I'm not sure about the universe. End of quote. This is from Einstein. Again, Einstein, who also told us what would happen if the bees died. The bees are dying. We know the bees are dying from aluminum. Again, investigate what I say on this show. Aluminum linked directly to the climate engineering fallout. Just one more factor, one more straw in the camel's back. But think about that quote from Einstein. Some current headlines. I want to go through this quickly. Again, I have a lot of ground to cover with some stories that I think most have not heard about. Quickly, Canadian Western Bank reignites concerns about energy loan losses at big banks. Statement from that report: a dramatic increase in expected energy-related loan losses at Canadian Western Bank has reignited concerns about financial meltdown. As the biosphere implodes, as the environment implodes, the facade of industrialized society and the economy will follow. It can't not happen. It will happen. Another headline: how a collapse in South America could trigger martial law in the U.S. Many would ask, how could that affect us here? How about refugees, for one? Those countries have been exploited immensely, and they have more than their own share of corruption within their borders. And all are card houses, just like the economy in the U.S., just like the economy throughout the globe. All completely unsustainable, all now beginning to collapse. Another headline: rail traffic depression. 292 Union Pacific engines are sitting in the Arizona desert doing nothing. Just like I spoke about the BDI, the Baltic Dry Index, all global dry shipping, the massive container ships, that industry now screeching to a halt. How long do you think this can be hidden? While the stock market is artificially pumped up to create the illusion that people's retirements are safe and sound while they use their houses for ATM machines to continue consuming in the paradigm that can't be maintained much longer, shipping is screeching to a halt. Another headline. Shell hints at further North Sea job cuts as profits plunge. Now, this is another sign again, industrialized society, fossil fuel propelled society is screeching to a halt, and the environment is again imploding at the same time. Another headline, Shell's profits plunge 83%. That's a rather big drop, I would say. Let's keep moving. Another headline, a tidal wave of defaults coming. Banks say oil town Americans missing auto and mortgage payments. Those who are dependent on the unsustainable paradigm are now struggling. Never sustainable. This is not hard to see. Again, the basic premise. How can you continue to expand perpetually and consume resources at an ever-increasing rate on a finite planet with finite resources? It's not possible. And those who want to defend that position are simply living in an illusion that's being shattered by the day. Another headline, the Great American Credit Collapse. Statement from that headline, please remember this warning when you go to the ATM to get cash and there is none. Now, consider how dependent we are on this incredibly delicately balanced paradigm that we all live in. It's not hard to see. If you simply stand back and take a look from a little bit of distance, it's clear that this fossil fuel fiesta, if you will, that we've all lived in, while our environment is completely consumed to keep it going, couldn't be maintained. So ask yourself what you will do if you go to the ATM machine and nothing comes out. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Another headline, Indian steel industry passing through severe downturn. Just like I went over in previous weeks about the Chinese steel industry crashing. 400,000 workers in China laid off. 400,000, nearly 500,000. It's all screeching to a halt right now. In addition to the economic issues in India, again, we have massive, deadly heat waves that started in April, continuing still today. So there's converging catastrophes all over the globe. Another headline, militants blow up Chevron oil platform in Niger Delta. Again, another sign of a disintegrating industrial paradigm. And as populations become more desperate, they do more desperate things. This is part of that paradigm, this headline. One more headline. What is the U.S. military doing in the Baltics? Get out before we start World War III. That's the full headline. Now, again, as the power structure begins to run out of options, as the biosphere implodes, as shipping starts to screech to a halt, and they have no more options, no more cards to play, what will the military-industrial complex do? They'll do what they do best, start global conflict. And all those chess pieces are being put into place right now. Another headline, Israel to upgrade ties with NATO. You have these alliances being made. And again, back to the previous headline, with the U.S. setting up in the Baltics. And this is close to home for me because my family's from Lithuania, part of my family, my wife's from there. That's where I met her, so this is close to home for us. Now, this would be like Russia setting up in Tijuana or on the border of Canada. How well would that go with Americans? Not very well. We need to dump our hypocrisy and start looking through a clear lens again. I'm not in love with Putin at all, but he's not doing what we're doing at this point. Boxing him in, that's what we're doing. And that will lead to World War III, and that appears to be on the agenda for the Western power structure. Another headline, Russia to form 3 new divisions to counter NATO buildup. Again, this plugs into what I just said. This is the arms race. This is the human insanity, the human bent toward suicide, its own suicide by, while the planet is imploding, we're simply involved in yet another arms race and a buildup for what would only be considered a final conflict on the planet. The planet can't take anymore. And that's the direction we're headed. And too many Americans are participating in that direction because they're simply going about their lives. They're not learning what's happening. They're watching the total propaganda on the corporate media, and they're not educating themselves. They're not participating in the fight for the common good. Another headline: Iran to close key oil shipping lanes if U.S. proceeds with military drills. The military drills the U.S. is carrying on everywhere, provoking countries everywhere, from the borders of China to the borders of Russia. This is not about freedom and democracy. Don't buy into the military commercials that make the simplistic statements, the U.S. Navy, a force for good. We're good, they're bad. If you buy into such a simplistic paradigm and think so dichotomously, you are missing the point. And I'm not criticizing necessarily our military men and women who have signed up for honorable reasons, but I am criticizing them if they blindly follow and don't consider their oath to the country and their fellow citizens, which I've stated many times, to protect the Constitution and their citizens against all threats, foreign and domestic. So it's time that our military brothers and sisters wake up and realize they're being used for mercenaries against their own people. Two more headlines. Fishermen protest as deadly red tide blooms in southern Chile. Statement from that headline: thousands of Chilean fishermen blocked roads with barricades in the region of Los Lagos on Monday and Tuesday, saying government's efforts to mitigate the economic effects of harmful algae bloom have been insufficient. Governments can't fix the damage done to the planet. The oceans are dying by the day. Terrestrial ecosystems are dying by the day. And all this plugs back into societal collapse, South American collapse, refugees pouring north, martial law in the U.S., this chain of dominoes with this incredibly balanced, completely unsustainable, industrialized society that people don't want to wake up from. They don't want to, but the sooner they do, the more chance we'll have of salvaging something. Don't be one of the sleeping population. Wake up. Final headline: thousands of tons of dead creatures hit Chile's beaches. Again, just one more indication of the die-off happening around the globe. On the candidates, again, I want to make a quick comment on the candidates before I get to some other stories. Candidates are all part of the power structure, and what a final showdown we're now faced with, it appears. If you bought into the delusion that the U.S. election will make any real difference, you're not yet awake, period. Clinton is clearly a criminal. Trump is absolutely a military-industrial complex company man. Trump just claimed that the U.S. is only trying to spread democracy in the Middle East. And if you believe that, you're completely in the dark. This is all part of the facade, the whole election. Now, what's our government hiding from its citizens? And I've given many examples in previous episodes of the function of the EPA and other environmental protection entities of the government. Their job is to hide the threat from the population, not to disclose it. So I'm about to read an excerpt from a letter from a federal EPA District 6 employee who's being investigated right now. I'm communicating with this person directly. He's participated in our attorney conference calls. His computer has been taken from him. And why is he being investigated? Because he tried to blow the whistle on the aluminum contamination that he feels is directly related to the climate engineering fallout and a fluoride issue. So here's a letter sent to me by him from PEER, the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. His name is on top of this letter, which I'll keep anonymous. It says, last week, Michigan Attorney General Bill Schuette filed criminal documents against Flint city officials and 2 state officials in the Department of Environmental Quality. Each of the state employees is charged with 3 felonies and 2 misdemeanors, including violations of the State Drinking Water Act and altering test results, tampering with evidence, and misconduct in office. This is business as usual. If you think that these agencies are there to protect you, if you think they're doing that job, you're living in an illusion, period. This report continues. It's unlikely that these 3 mid-level managers engineered this public health disaster on their own. So Schuette has promised these charges are only the beginning and there will be more to come. That I can guarantee you. The whole system is corrupt. The whole system. And how can a system hide the total planetary contamination from what's being sprayed above our heads? Flint, Michigan is the tip of the iceberg. Absolutely the tip of the iceberg. All of us, every single one of us that lives and breathes is now irreparably contaminated from the climate engineering fallout. And so many people are so invested in hiding that lie. even for their own self-interest, to protect their paycheck and pension, or even to protect their state of mind. They will support that lie. They're doubling down on the lie, because now to admit to it, whether you're a meteorologist or a local journalist, like I mentioned, our KRCR people like Mike Mangus, who is absolutely hidden, even from letters from a 40-year aeronautics engineer who wrote him, backing up the information on geoengineeringwatch.org, who Mike Mangus refused to even correspond with once he knew he was corresponding with people who had the credentials to absolutely prove the reality to him, simply deleted the emails. Same with Mike Kruger, our meteorologist, and all the meteorologists across the country. All these people in so many arenas are so invested in the lie that climate engineering isn't happening, that to admit to it now would be to totally discredit themselves. So they all continue towing the line on the lie, while the elephant in the room above our heads continues every day, while our planet continues to be contaminated, our weather continues to be disrupted, our ozone layer continues to be shredded every single day. The system and those in the system are completely invested in the lie. Think about that. It's just like Flint, Michigan, and they won't say anything until they're caught, period. It's up to us to learn what's happening and to help expose them by sending them credible data. And when you see that they won't respond to that data, when you see they're hiding, when you see that they're cowering in the shadows because they are more concerned about their paychecks and pensions than they are public welfare, then that's what should arouse public outrage toward these people, period. So that hopefully at one point they can be put on trial in Nuremberg-type settings, because these people are accomplices to the crimes, period, just like those in Flint, Michigan. No difference. Now, one more letter to this EPA representative that I mentioned, and this is important as well. I'm reading only small parts from each of these letters because these were sent to me from this individual personally, who's being investigated again by the EPA, federal EPA. He's a biologist, and because he tried to tell the truth. And is that any surprise? We know this Obama administration has prosecuted more whistleblowers than all other administrations combined. So here's from another letter from this EPA representative. Breaking. Just hours ago, the Colorado Supreme Court issued an undemocratic and politically driven decision to invalidate the fracking ban in Longmont, Colorado, and the moratorium in Fort Collins, Colorado. Both measures were passed at the ballot despite overwhelming industry spending. What's that mean? It means the citizens there voted overwhelmingly to ban fracking. Why wouldn't they? Fracking is an absolutely insane practice. Does it take a lot of intellect to figure out that punching a hole in the ground, pumping in 500 plus highly toxic chemicals, contaminating groundwater forever is not a good idea? Is that hard to figure out? So we have citizens who overwhelmingly voted to ban this practice at the ballot box, and a judge simply overturns that vote. This is not a democracy, period. Citizens thus have no right to defend themselves now because the power structure simply ignores them. Same is true across the board. If you don't think this is going on, you're living in an illusion. Now, I want to get to a story that most have not heard of, have no idea about, and this matters. Here's the headline from the story. Hanford, not Fukushima, is the big radiological threat to the West Coast. How many people even know about the Hanford nuclear site on the U.S. West Coast on the Columbia River? How many people even heard of this? What I'm saying is, just like the Flint, Michigan issue, just like the fracking issue in Colorado I just overturned, the power structure does whatever it wants right under our noses, and the American population, by and large, has been all too happy to go along, ignore it all, as long as they could keep consuming, buying cars with nothing down, no payments, no interest, using their house for an ATM. If we don't wake up from that paradigm and focus on what's been happening to our biosphere, so the power structure could maintain its hold on humanity. If we don't face these issues, it's game over. That simple. Let me continue with this headline. There's a dangerous radiological threat to the U.S. West Coast of the United States that puts the health of millions of Americans at risk. It includes dangers to the public health, dangers to the food supply, and dangers to the future generations from long-lived radionuclides, including some of the most toxic materials in the world. It is not Fukushima, it is Hanford. While radiation from the Fukushima nuclear meltdown is reaching the West Coast, carried across the ocean from Japan, the radiation from Hanford is already there and has been there for 70 years and is a serious risk of catastrophe that could dwarf the effects of Fukushima even on Japan. Now, that's a big statement, isn't it? This headline is new, by the way. This is not an old story. I mean, obviously, it's a very old story if we look at the history, but Americans haven't been told. Continuing from this report, Hanford on the Columbia River in eastern Washington state is the site where the United States produced the majority of its plutonium for nuclear weapons during the Cold War. These tens of thousands of American nuclear weapons were built as an end product of the high levels of plutonium production at Hanford. The first 3 nuclear reactors on Earth were built at Hanford, with a total of 9 nuclear power plants being built there eventually. Nuclear power plants operated for 10 years before they were ever used to generate electricity. They were making plutonium, right? Electricity is a secondary purpose for the nuclear power plants. They were designed and built as plutonium manufacturing plants. Again, huge sign of the human race's propensity toward suicide. Continuing, Hanford was the first of these plutonium production sites. The 2 worst radiological disasters, besides nuclear weapons detonations, in the first 4 decades of the atomic age were accidents at the plutonium production sites of the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union, both in 1957. Military plutonium production sites remain among the most contaminated sites on Earth. During the period of operation for more than 67 metric tons of plutonium were manufactured at Hanford. 67 tons of plutonium. Think about that. 67 tons. Hanford is home to 60% by volume of all the high-level radioactive waste stored in the United States. 60%. Think about that. How many people even know this site exists? Nearly 80% of the Department of Energy's inventory of spent nuclear fuel rods are stored just 400 yards away from the Columbia River. Those statistics, by the way, were taken from the Physicians for Responsible Government webpage. Now, here's a brief review of some of the worst impacts and dangers of the Hanford site. In December of 1949, the United States deliberately released an immense amount of radiation into populated areas at the Hanford site during the notorious Green Run. It was the largest intentional release of radiation conducted by the U.S. government. If you think our government gives a damn about you, those who really run the government, you're delusional. Delusional. Wake up. Let me continue from this report. While nuclear testing in Nevada exposed many people to significant amounts of radiation, this was a byproduct of the desire to test weapons. In the Green Run, the intention was specifically to release the radiation into the Hanford area. The Green Run was conducted in reaction to the test of the first Soviet nuclear weapon in Kazakhstan several months earlier. The first indications that the Soviets had successfully tested a nuclear weapon came when sensors at Hanford picked up the radiation several days later. It was decided to release radiation, quote, similar to that of the Soviet test to develop and hone detection equipment and better analysis of the Soviet program. Think about that. In order to just better their analysis and test their equipment, they released radiation on U.S. populations. Business as usual, just like climate engineering. Continuing with the report, as bad as this deliberate release of radiation into the downwind communities was, things did not go as planned. The intended amount of iodine-131 to be released was dwarfed by the actual release, which was double what was anticipated. While scientists imagined they would then be tracking a coherent cloud as it moved away from the site, the resulting radiation dispersed throughout a vast area stretching across much of Washington state and into southern Oregon. Concentrations were found in valleys and lowlands as the radiation distributed. Intentional release by our government on our population. Consider that. Internalizing iodine-131 is a direct cause of thyroid cancer. More from this report. The tank farms. All of you know about the tank farms, or most of you do, in Fukushima. They're simply building more and more tanks to hold this constantly building radiated water. Same thing in Hanford. Few things pose as great a threat to public health at Hanford than the tank farms. The tank farms are 177 single and double-shelled waste storage tanks sited at 2 different locations on the Hanford complex. In the early days at Hanford, when plutonium for nuclear weapons was separated from the spent nuclear fuel, the leftover uranium from the process was stored in these tanks. Over the years, a wide range of the highest level radioactive and chemical wastes were dumped into these tanks. According to the state of Washington, the 177 tanks hold 53 million gallons of the highest level radioactive waste existing in the United States. 53 million gallons. 67 of the single-shell tanks have leaked. Over 1 million gallons of this highly radioactive waste, which was migrating through the soil and groundwater into the Columbia River. In 2011, the Department of Energy emptied the contents of many of the leaking single-shelled tanks into double-shelled tanks. However, the design of the double-shelled tanks was found to be flawed, resulting in further leaks. Why is this report so important? By itself, it's extremely important, but it also shows the business as usual of the U.S. government and those who work in the government, all those who are willing to participate in the insanity so long as it provides a paycheck and a pension. How do these people look themselves in the mirror? How can they look at their children? This is business as usual, and the same is true with the climate engineering insanity that's contaminating the entire planet. People ask, why would they do this to themselves? I hear it all the time. Why would, quote, they, and ultimately they is the central bankers, why would they do this to themselves? How many examples do we need of them doing this to themselves? They're living on the same planet we are. We're not dealing with sanity. People need to understand that. And once you have a cancer, is it in the intent of the cancer to kill its host? No. The cancer's intent is to proliferate, to expand its grip on the host until it kills the host. Period. That's what's happening. And so many people that we all know, are part of this cancer because they're participating in the proliferation of the cancer. Continuing from this report, dealing with the 53 million gallons of highly radioactive waste is a multi-billion-dollar effort designed to manage the waste by 2050. On this current course, by the way, none of us will be here in 2050 or 2040 or likely 2030. That's a mathematical fact given the current rate of die-off on our planet. So these figures are dire, but in some senses irrelevant if we stay on this course. Continuing from the report, or roughly 100 years after it was first manufactured. Again, why would any sane species completely box itself in by manufacturing this type of contaminant that is a certain death sentence, ultimately? But this is what's happening on our planet. We have Fukushima going on. Again, on top of all this, any of these two facilities could exterminate life on Earth, and may, and we're building 60 more nuke plants right now. Why would they do this to themselves? Well, we have too many examples of it happening already. If you walk away from what's happening, or you pretend it isn't happening because of that simple statement, you think that, quote, those in power wouldn't do this to themselves, you're simply not living in reality. Continuing from the report. Currently, almost nothing has yet been accomplished towards this goal, which is securing this radioactive material by 2050. Paying out of the contracts to design plans and begin the construction of the vitrification plant that is intended to encase the waste in glass. In recent years, numerous whistleblowers have come forward from among Hanford employees to describe the flawed design and safety protocols of the VIT plant. Most of these whistleblowers have been fired by the contractors running the Hanford cleanup. No surprise, is it? Just like the federal District 6 EPA employee that I mentioned earlier, who is being investigated and will likely be fired at some point because he dared to tell the truth. The cancer doesn't want anyone to tell the truth. So many people are willing not to, as long as it pays. And this will lead to, again, all of our demise if we continue. More in the report. One Walter Tamosaitis, the research and technology manager of the VIT plant, was vindicated and awarded $4.3 million to settle his wrongful termination suit. However, other whistleblowers have been dismissed from their positions since that award. While the liquid waste has been extracted from the tanks, the remaining high-level waste in the tanks remains largely untreated. Hanford employees who worked maintaining the tank farms have suffered serious and unexplained health problems in recent years. Each year, numerous workers have been exposed to vapors and have become sick or lost consciousness and require hospitalization. Many have suffered ongoing health problems as a result of these exposures. In 2014, over 40 workers suffered from such exposures, including a 2-week period in late March that saw 26 workers hospitalized. These are recent stats, by the way. This is ongoing right now. According to KGW News in Portland, the 1977 study conducted by the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory warned that workers exposed to vapors from the specific tanks would have significantly increased risk of cancers and other serious diseases, but the conclusions of this report were never made public or shared with Hanford workers or members of the federally chartered Hanford Advisory Board. Think about all that. So we have agencies who had reports stating how harmful it was to even be in this facility, and none of that was disclosed, not even to the workers. Not even to the workers. And those people who don't disclose this information, are they not accessories to the crimes? They're part of the crime. Just like all those I mentioned earlier, people who should know, who must know what's going on, for example, in our skies. If we're talking about meteorologists, there's only two possibilities. Either they are unimaginably derelict in their field and ignorant in their field, which makes them completely unqualified to be meteorologists if they don't know this is going on in our skies, or they are lying. There's only two possibilities. Which do you think is the most likely? Certainly, the meteorologists know this is happening. And I know this from first-hand communications with some, including NOAA employees. By the way, again, just for the record, federal gag order on all National Weather Service and all NOAA employees. Think about that. Search it online. You'll find our coverage of that statement as well. Continuing from the Hanford report, I want to get done with this. Contamination and dangers. The EPA has identified between 1,500 and 1,200 specific sites on the Hanford grounds where toxic or radioactive chemicals have been dumped. Think about this. The ambiguity of that number speaks volumes about the lack of record keeping and functional data for addressing these problems. As I've stated all along, agencies are tasked with hiding threats from the public, not disclosing them. Continuing from the report, if plans for remediation of the waste in the tank farms at the Hanford site are carried out as intended, there remains a massive contamination of the soil and groundwater under the site, leaching into the Columbia River and surrounding countryside. That is, if things go well. Things could go badly. The Kashtan disaster, this is in the Soviet Union, shows the dangers of explosion in one of the tanks storing waste in such as that stored in the 177 tanks at Hanford. About 8,000 people died in that one single tank explosion in the Soviet Union, which again, there's 177 of these tanks at Hanford. Continuing, an incident in which multiple tanks experience problems could be catastrophic beyond our imagination. What's more, there's not an effective containment or security at the tank farms to face the threats of concurrent times. While the countries around the world worry about dangers of flying airplanes or drones into nuclear power plants or cyber attacks on the power supplies to such plants, those sites have at least some effective containment around the toxic materials they hold. The tank farms are open air, and tank farms in Hanford are open air and unshielded. The amount of deadly radiological materials contained in these tanks is far beyond that contained in any single nuclear site in the United States. How many people don't even know about Hanford? Final paragraph. Hanford is here, Fukushima is there. The triple meltdown at Fukushima Daiichi was a horrible disaster that has released massive amounts of radiation into the environment. The daily passage of tons of water through the waste watershed below the plants where the melted nuclear cores sit smoldering will continue to release radiation into the ocean for decades to come. The health toll that this will take, especially on the children of northern Japan, is horrifying. Already, a much higher than expected incidence of thyroid cancer has been reported in the area youth. This is the first of the cancers to present, and it is the tip of the iceberg of health impacts on those in the area. The release of long-lived radionuclides, such as cesium-137 and uranium into the ecosystem, presents dangers to people all around the world as these particles cycle through the biosphere. But the largest and most tragic impacts of Fukushima will be on the people of Japan. The plumes from the explosion of March 2011 deposited the bulk of their fallout within a few hundred kilometers of the plant. Radiation from the regular releases of contaminated water into the ocean and the passage of groundwater across the corium, this is subsurface, will continue to bring radioactive particles into the Pacific Ocean, where they will work their way up the food chain, much as the fallout deposited by atmospheric nuclear testing did in the Pacific during the 1940s and 1950s. Some of that radiation is reaching the west coast of the U.S., and this will continue as long as the site hemorrhages contaminated water into the ocean, which will likely be for many decades. This disaster should not be discounted, but it should also be remembered that it is the people of Japan, and specifically the children of Japan, who live in the areas where the fallout plumes deposited that face the direst of these consequences. There is currently a great deal of awareness about the arrival of Fukushima radiation on the West Coast. There are many people who say they will not eat fish from the Pacific Ocean or eat from Japan. At the same time, there is no discussion about eating salmon from the Columbia River, drinking wines from the Columbia Valley, or fruit from the orchards that fill the downwind area around Hanford. The amount of radiation in the Hanford area dwarfs the amount arriving on the west coast of the United States on a scale that is mind-boggling. What is arriving from Fukushima is the result of meltdowns of 3 nuclear cores, and it is crossing an ocean. While stored at Hanford and leaching into the Columbia is the resultant 2/3 of the high-level nuclear waste of the United States, and is from production that began decades before Fukushima was built. This is not just contamination that is arriving today or this year. It has been saturating the groundwater and ecosystem of the Northwest for more than 70 years. Furthermore, the impacts from Hanford are not only what may happen, but what has already happened. Hanford downwinders have suffered generations of cancers and other diseases across the wide area of eastern Washington and beyond. There's a legacy of death and illness that spans generations downwind from Hanford, and the source of those diseases percolates away from the tanks and waste sites that sit along the Columbia River, spreading deeper into the surrounding ecosystems. The radiation from Fukushima may slowly seep across the vast Pacific, while at Hanford we have the threat of radiological explosion or terrorist acts that could release volumes more radiation than was released by Fukushima and deposited in Japan any day of any week, and spread radiation across the west coast and mountain west. By all means, we should be vigilant and monitor the levels of Fukushima radiation that arrives on the west coast of the United States, while remembering that the most profound victims of Fukushima are children living near the site. We should turn our attention and concerns to the radioactive wound that seeps radiation into the ecosystem of America and Canada every day, and threatens it with radiological disaster that would dwarf the worst Fukushima has done, even in Japan. Stand up for Hanford whistleblowers. Demand transparency on waste management practices and plans at Hanford. Stand up for the health of Hanford workers who are being exposed to dangerous vapors in the workplace. And demand support and compensation for the downwind families. Now, again, consider the magnitude of the Hanford site that the population is completely oblivious to while they're focused on Fukushima. And that's part of the goal of the power structure. That's how they hide such major, major threats in plain sight. Mass distraction. Consider this is in our backyard. Massive and ongoing contamination. Consider the mentality behind any such plant. Consider the mentality behind the human race and those who wave their flags and claim that we need to have such nuclear nightmares to, quote, defend ourselves. How is that defending ourselves? Creating scenarios that will lead to certain suicide for the human race and perhaps all life on Earth. How is that defending ourselves? The human race needs to stand back and take a long, hard look at what they're doing. Let's remember the Einstein quote that I read at the beginning of this show. Now, to weave all this into the larger picture again, and back to another ongoing human practice of total omnicide. Omnicide, again, is not just ecocide or genocide. Omnicide is total destruction of life on Earth, and that's where we're headed. And climate engineering is another major factor in this equation, in addition to the nuclear nightmares like the one I just went over as fast as I could from the Hanford site, which most people have never even heard of. Exponentially worse than Fukushima, in all likelihood. So back to the fires now that are a direct result. This is important to understand. The fires that are burning, not just in Canada, but the Himalayas are burning down right now. We've had Siberia burning down in recent years. About 100 million acres a year of forest going up in Siberia. 100 million. And for those people who say CO2 is not a problem, do you really think that all this CO2 just floats out into space and that it's not a problem when the oceans are dying because they're acidifying from too much CO2? The CO2 is what allows us to live here. It's a blanket. What happens if you put 2 or 3 more blankets on your bed at night? You get a lot warmer, right? Blanket's good, keeps you warm at night. But what if you have 10 blankets? Not so good, is it? That's exactly what's happening to the planet. And it triggers feedback loops. So now we have feedback loops fueling fires. And when we have the climate science community, back to those who are willing to lie for a paycheck and a pension, telling us that the fires are simply a result of climate change, and I'm not saying climate change isn't real, I'm not saying that climate change isn't a result of countless human activities that are damaging the planet and the excessive buildup of CO2. I'm not saying that that's not all related. It is related. It's a part of the problem. But in regard to the protracted droughts happening around the globe and the fires that are being created, that is most directly attributable to climate engineering. Why? Because climate engineering is totally disrupting the hydrological cycle, cutting off the rain to forests everywhere. It's part of the goal of climate engineering, not just to block the sun, but to reduce atmospheric RH, atmospheric relative humidity. I had an architect in these programs from the Oak Ridge Lab in a conversation which I published tell me this. It's on the record. You can search GeoEngineering Insider Speaks Out and see this dialogue. That they were trying to reduce atmospheric relative humidity, and atmospheric relative humidity has gone down since about the mid-40s when we know these programs started. And by the way, another interesting statistic that all should consider, we just broke the 12th consecutive month. April 2016 was the 12th consecutive month of the warmest month ever recorded on the planet since record keeping began. Now, doesn't mean the warmest April. It means the warmest month, period, ever. We've had 12 consecutive record-breaking months, one after another, of the warmest month ever recorded. Shouldn't that send up an alarm somewhere? And yet we have the Climate Hustle film claiming that there's no global warming. If you're living in that delusion, wake up while you can still do some good. And the point I want to make is, when's the last time we had a record like this? 1944. In 1944, we had 10 consecutive months of warmest month ever recorded. 10. In 1944, directly prior to global climate engineering being deployed. And as I've stated in other programs and many articles, the initial effect of the spraying of particulates in the atmosphere did have a cooling effect. Very toxic, but it had a cooling effect. They were focusing on the poles, creating the ozone destruction that we know we have now over the northern and southern hemispheres. But that was success to the military-industrial complex. Didn't matter if they were creating a massively worse problem overall. They could temporarily hide it from the population, and that's what they're good at, isn't it? Just like the Corexit in the Gulf of Mexico. Doesn't matter if that made that situation 52 times more toxic, literally. It hid the oil, and this is what they want. They don't look at the long-term consequences because the clinically insane don't. This is a common thread, psychoanalysis of those with various forms of psychosis like psychopathic individuals, a near total lack of comprehension of the consequences of their own actions even to themselves. So this is business as usual, hide the problem. 10 record months in 1944, climate engineering commenced, leveling off of the temperature rise for 30 years until the negative effects kick in, then the warming takes off with a vengeance again, and what does the military-industrial complex do? What they do best. Double down. Just spray more. If pounding your head against the wall starts to hurt, you just need to pound it harder. And that's what they do. So now we have wildfires happening everywhere. Feedback loops are kicking in. We have the rain cycle disrupted, as I mentioned, as we have these record warm months happening over and over. And so in regard to the single greatest causal factors with the fires that are raging in Canada and raging in the Himalayas, climate engineering must be considered the single greatest causal factor, not global warming. Because on a warming planet, minus geoengineering, minus the spraying of these toxic moisture-absorbing particles into the atmosphere, they're called desiccants, minus that you would have a wetter world. The laws of physics say this must happen. The atmosphere carries 7% more moisture for every degree centigrade of warming. It should rain more on a warming planet. The planet tries to respond. The forests start to thrive and absorb carbon instead of dying. And they're dying because, again, disrupted hydrological cycle from geoengineering, shredded ozone layer from geoengineering, toxic materials falling everywhere, contaminating root systems from geoengineering, aluminum being a primary element, and we have peer-reviewed study that says conclusively when trees and other organisms, when their root systems sense aluminum, they shut down nutrient uptake. They die. But what do the experts tell us why the trees are dying? What do all the agencies who are tasked with hiding the situation, what do they tell us? It's just the beetles. That's what they tell us. It's not all the toxic materials, it's not the shredded ozone layer, it's not the disrupted hydrological cycle, it's not the desiccant materials, aluminums, or excuse me, not desiccant, incendiary materials that are coating the foliage that makes the fires burn hotter. It's not any of that, it's just the beetles. It's all the beetles' fault. That's one more way they try to hide the real issue, by pointing at a symptom and not the core cause, period. Keep that in mind. These agencies are tasked with hiding the real cause. And I know this for a fact. I've worked with USDA scientists. I've been in the field with them, as I mentioned before, in the field with congressional reps and USDA scientists looking at a hillside full of dead trees, asking the whole group in front of these scientists, asking the scientists, do you see any forest decline? And they shake their heads and say no. And again, at that point, day is night, up is down, black is white, and we simply have a whole class of academicians and agency people who are all too willing to lie for a paycheck and a pension. Search geoengineering creates drought. And you will find everything I'm saying is documented in many, many sources. Now, I want to mention a quote about the Alberta wildfire from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who, when I saw him on an interview the other day, he looked like a kid in the headlights, saying what he was told to say. So Trudeau said this: people should not conclude climate change was to blame. He continued, it's well known that one of the consequences of climate change will be a greater prevalence of extreme weather events around the planet. He continued, however, any time we try to make a political argument out of one particular disaster, that can sometimes have the desired outcome, not have the desired outcome. Trudeau simply, like the meteorologists, like the journalists who I've named here locally and across the planet, who are simply paid to lie. If they don't know climate engineering is going on, they're unimaginably ignorant or they're lying. In either case, it doesn't look good for them, does it? So here we have Trudeau, who absolutely knows this is going on, and to not attribute this is simply criminal for someone in his position, period. Now, Trudeau further described this fire event as the largest fire evacuation in Alberta's history. Now, this is May. This is happening in May in Canada, areas that never burnt almost ever during the year, and it's burning to the ground in May. We had the same thing last year in Siberia. Massive wildfires in April in Siberia in places that are normally frozen solid until June. And again, in Siberia, in previous years, recent years, it's lost about 100 million acres a year to forest fire, fires that are most directly attributable to the effects of climate engineering. The planet's life support systems are burning to the ground, literally. In the Himalayas, the number of reported fires this year is up to nearly 1,700. This is about an 850% increase, 850% compared to the whole of 2015. So far this year, an 800% increase over all of last year. The planet is absolutely burning to the ground. It's up to all of us to help expose these issues. Here's a famous quote, a proverb, if you will. People often claim to hunger for the truth, but seldom like the taste when it is served up. Psychoanalysis and reason make clear that the hallmark of a healthy mind is an unyielding willingness to face reality no matter how dire. Burying one's head in the sand does not provide safety from impending danger. If we're to have any chance of avoiding short-term total extinction on our once thriving planet, we must all stand together in the all-important effort to wake the sleeping masses, in the all-important effort to completely alter our current course of certain demise. What is your part in the unfolding drama? What will you do with your time today? What will be your priorities? Exposing and halting the ongoing climate engineering insanity is the single greatest leap we could collectively make in the right direction. If we can do this, we can begin to face the rest of the immense challenges that we've created for ourselves as a species. The vast majority will not sacrifice anything in the fight for the common good. What about you? Are you willing to give your time and energy to the greater good? Are you willing to do some objective research, find out what's happening around you, and to help sound the alarm? All of us are needed in this battle. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org.